Thank you for coming. My name is Tad Smith. I'm president of Cablevision's local media organization, which oversees Newsday, News 12, AM New York, as well as MSG Varsity. It's a pleasure to have you all today. I am going to stand up here for about 1 minute, and you will see me again at the end. I'm about to introduce the president of Hofstra, but before I do that, a couple of administrative items. First of all, we are starting just a few minutes late. We will end promptly at 11 a.m. We have a terrific group of guests today. And the last thing you will see me say at the end is some upcoming Renew New York events. I do want to call out three people whose tireless effort over the last few weeks has made this possible. One is Hofstra's Melissa Connolly. Where is she? Big round of applause. Two is the head of the editorial board for Newsday, Rita Cioli. Where's Rita? Over there. Yeah, she's hiding because she doesn't want you to know where to write letters. It's over there. And then finally, Deborah Lund, who runs strategy for local media. Where's Deborah? Thank you. A couple of reminders. News 12 is filming this event with multiple cameras in the back. We will be, I think in fact it's going to be running live actually on the webcast. They will also be using outtakes of it for news, so everything that is said will be on the record. And then finally, please, cell phones on vibrate or silent, also especially for the panelists. But let me introduce our host, who really needs no introduction because he is such a prominent state and also certainly Long Island leader, Stuart Rabinowitz, the president of Hofstra. Thank you, Stuart, for having us.
Contrary to my usual habit, I will be very brief today. I know you're not here to listen to me. I simply want to welcome everybody to this event, which is really the first in a series of events called Renew New York. And it is essentially a dialogue or a conversation over the next 6 months about the major problems that face our state and how perhaps we should approach them. And it's a wonderful partnership between three different organizations with a lot in common, and that is, of course, News 12 and Cablevision and Newsday and Hofstra University. And what we have in common, particularly, is that in different ways, it's each organization's responsibility to educate the public and to provide a forum for educating the public. So we bring together all of our talents and all of our contacts and all of our energies so that over the next 6 months we can help better educate the public. We all read the newspaper this morning. It was incredibly depressing, I thought, in terms of the poll results, which you'll hear about. But this is inspiring to see this kind of a crowd with so many officials. I mean, there are so many officials here of importance and policymakers and interested citizens that if I started introducing you all by name, we'd never get through. So just a general thank you for coming and for attending. And so this conversation will hopefully inform the public over the next 6 months, perhaps even generate some sound and innovative approaches to the question and allow us to listen to leaderships or those who vie for leadership in the election, and so that we can see and make our own judgment about whether they're going to provide the visionary leadership which we all need. So the conversation begins today. Hopefully it will culminate 6 months from now. It will culminate 6 months from now in a gubernatorial debate, also sponsored by the three organizations. So to begin the conversation, it's my pleasure to call to the podium an old friend, a two-term county executive of Nassau County, Tom Suozzi.
Thank you, Stuart. Let's start by thanking Hofstra University for their leadership here on Long Island in so many regards. When everybody's worried about the economy and trying to hold on to what they have, Hofstra is always moving forward, not only with its presidential series that it does every year, along with its Institute for Suburban Studies, its study of real estate here on Long Island, and everything that they've done to make Long Island a better place to live in, including the upcoming medical center or medical school that they're starting here at Hofstra in conjunction with North Shore LIJ. Let's thank Hofstra one more time for their great leadership, moving us forward. And a special thank you to Cablevision, who I'm working as a consultant for these days. But thanking them, it's really amazing. People are actually paying me for my advice now instead of me having to force it upon them. I want to thank Cablevision and the local media group. We're going to hear a lot this year about the national debate. We've followed what's been going on most recently as Tuesday in the national elections. And we've faced specific problems here in New York State and here on Long Island. And Cablevision and News 12 are helping us to focus these issues, not to get just caught up in the national debate alone, but to focus on the local issues that affect us here in New York State. Let's thank Newsday and News 12. Okay, so I've been asked to take you through this poll here today. People consider me an expert in polling. Let me first let you know that, that polls are not always 100% accurate. Let me just tell you that in 2006, some of you may recall I was in a primary against Eliot Spitzer. And in that poll, it suggested I would only get 16% of the vote. And in reality, I had got like 18 or 19% of the vote. So it really was an amazing sense of accuracy. So how was this poll conducted? The poll sponsors are, of course, Newsday and Hofstra University, and it was conducted by an independent group, the Princeton Survey Research International, and the methodology was to poll 1,500 people here in New York State with an oversample here on Long Island to get a sense of exactly what's going on with Long Islanders. It was done with landline and cell phones. It was conducted from April 19th to May 9th, and the results are statistically weighted. But again, it's important to remember that when you're doing a poll, it's important who you are polling because, again, in my own personal experience, in my race for county executive, the race showed I was ahead by many points before the race. But we saw that very few people turned out for the race. So it's important that you're polling the people that will actually be turning out for the election. And so when this poll was conducted, one of the specific questions is how often do you vote in New York State and New York elections, New York State and Long Island elections. And of course, we see on this 51% of the people say always, I always vote. 55% of Long Islanders commented on that. And nearly always, 24% of New Yorkers and 23% of Long Islanders. And the results of this poll, the major finding, as you read about in Newsday this morning, is that people are not very happy. They're in a bad mood. That's a big surprise. I could have told you that saved a lot of money. But it's really remarkable at how overwhelming it is. 76% of New York State voters say they are angry or frustrated with the federal government. 76%. And here on Long Island, it's much stronger. 81% of the people say that they are angry or frustrated. And again, we've seen this with the election results on Tuesday with Specter, with Rand Paul, and with Blanche Lincoln. That people all over America are facing this. But here in New York State, I was at an event not long ago with President Clinton where he was talking about how New York State is one of the rare examples in the country where the frustration in the state of New York, with the state of New York, is actually greater than it is nationally for the federal government. And we saw that in the poll results as well, where we saw 83% of New York voters are frustrated with New York State government. 83% angry or frustrated. And that number is even higher with Long Islanders. 90%. 90%. I mean, you don't see this in polls normally. 90% of the people are saying they are angry or frustrated with New York State government. It's really an overwhelming number. And when you look at who the people are that are angry and frustrated, we see what we probably find in our own personal experiences. The older you get, the angrier you get. The more angry and frustrated. But look at 50 to 64-year-olds. 45% are angry. You know, you can see the different coloring on here. The lower number is angry. The higher numbers are frustrated. So 50 to 64-year-olds, 45% of the people are angry. 18 to 29-year-olds, only 22% of the people are angry. And you have to understand that that age group of 50 to 64 just saw their opportunities to retire go down the drain when the economy fell apart. Their pension funds and their savings accounts were decimated. Their investments were taken apart. They face a great uncertainty, and they don't see things getting done by their elected officials. And you look also at the demographics of white, black, and Hispanic. 42% of white voters angry, whereas you see black and Hispanic voters only 26 and 24%. Similar with frustrated. So it's interesting to notice that, and it would be very interesting with all of these different findings to hear the comments from the professionals that will be coming up here in a few minutes to talk about the different demographic groups and how they feel these problems need to be addressed. Next, by region and party affiliation. You see a big difference of this anger and frustration by urban upstate, rural upstate, Long Island, Hudson Valley, with a pretty big drop-off in New York City. Difference not as dramatic between Democratic voters and Republican voters. But remember, the problems that we face in the state are common, and that we all face serious problems with the economy. But upstate New York has faced very serious problems with the economy for a lot longer period of time that are not related solely to the national economic crisis, but to problems they've been facing for a long period of time, as well as a property tax problem. And here on Long Island and the downstate suburbs, we see a dramatic anger and frustration towards property taxes. So it may account for some of the different changes that you see between the different groups. Something very, very important is the number of independent voters that see themselves as just straight out angry. 42% of independent voters are angry as compared to 31% and 36% of Republican voters. And the experts will tell you when they get up here that independent voters are the name of the game in a lot of different elections. They'll make the difference in what happens. How their swing vote goes will determine how the election will go. So, good news. People want to fix Albany. They want to see something happen. They want to see something dramatic. You know, I didn't just make that up, that saying, but 70%, this is really a big number. 70% of the people, of the registered voters, say they want to see major structural reform. 70%. And then another 26% would like to see some reform. But 70% saying they want to see major structural reform is a big, big number. And the things that they're talking about that they vote in favor of seeing reformed, as far as some of the structural issues that we face in Albany, are the type of things that will make the editorial boards throughout the state happy. They'll make the good government groups and NYPIRG and on with the different groups happy. And it'll make our state legislators nervous. And that's what you need in order to make change, because there needs to be a sense by our elected officials that people want to see change. And so we see on here, these are really dramatic types of changes. State legislature term limits, 76% support. Lower limits on campaign contributions, 74%. Allow New Yorkers to directly vote on referendums and initiatives, 72%. Require more than a majority vote in the legislature to raise taxes, 60%. Create a nonpartisan commission to redraw legislative districts, 56%. I mean, these are pretty wonky things. The fact that the public is even aware of them is a good sign of how educated they are and how much they are paying attention. But surprisingly is this last one, where only 41% say they support changes to the state constitution. And for those that support a state constitution, change is going to require a lot more education of the public in order to get to that point. But each of these issues are very big, dramatic changes. And the fact that the public is as aware of them as they seem to be by commenting on these is a good sign that bodes well for change. But we find that the voters have little support for specific independent items related to how to fix the problem. When you ask them about cut the state employees' salaries and benefits, lay off state employees, cut spending on public transit, raise the state income tax, raise the sales tax, cut spending on health care, cut AIDS education, nobody wants to do any of it. They want change, they want the problems addressed, but they don't want any of this to happen. And the bottom line is that's why we need leadership. That's what the role of leadership is to lead people towards these very tough decisions. It would have been interesting to ask this question in terms of you have to pick one, which is the problems that our elected officials and our leaders face. Is they have to pick one. And when you ask people, do they want to make tough decisions? Would you like to see someone lose their job because of your choice? Would you like to see someone's taxes? No, I don't want to see that. I just want the problem fixed. But that's the role of leaders, is to take us through these tough decisions and to help us find solutions, even though it's not clear at the outset that you're going to get universal support for an individual item. But we need leadership in order to address these very real problems and to address the anger people have, because the problem's not going to go away. They'll stay angry, and they'll just take it out on everyone unless someone exercises the leadership. So this next slide is very, very interesting. It's a common problem for those of you that have followed politics for a while, is that people often are polled to say, I can't stand the legislature, whether it's the Congress or the state legislature, whatever it may be. I can't stand the legislature, but I love my legislator. Can't stand them, but my local person is great. And that's the way it's always been. And we still see some remnants of that in these poll results. However, when you see your support for your state senator or your state assembly person only going as high, seeing 43% oppose your local person, or 43% oppose your state senator, 40% oppose your state assembly member, those are pretty high numbers for opposing your local person. Your local person is the one you know. It's the one that shows up at the events, that shows up at the ribbon cuttings and comes to make speeches to your local groups, that provides aid in the form of different legislation or earmarks or member items, and they're in the community on a regular basis marching on the parade. It's hard to oppose that person you know who's around all the time. But I think that, and it would be interesting to hear comments from our panelists later, when you see 43% or 40% oppose their local person, their own person, that's a big number. More generically, you see the numbers much higher. 57% say, I can't stand most members. 57% say, I can't stand most members of the state assembly or the state senate. We look at the approval ratings. Big surprise here is that there's not the same type of anger being directed towards, well, maybe it's not a big surprise, towards Barack Obama. You still see 63% of New Yorkers and 53% of Long Islanders approving of his performance. Now, remember that he won the state of New York by about 63%, or maybe it was Long Island he won by 63%. I apologize, I can't remember the number. What was it? 66% statewide or Long Island? Yeah. So but we see what we've been reading about for a long time, that the governor is not doing very well. The New York State Senate, only 23% and 25% approval, New York State, Long Island. New York State Assembly, 24% approval, 19% approval here on Long Island. Very, very big numbers, again, for people to be concerned about. And who are they pointing the finger of blame at? State Senate seems to be the number one, largely to blame. 45% has received a tremendous amount of press over the past year about the dysfunction going on in the State Senate over the past year with the leadership battles and the failure to get the budget done. State Assembly, not blamed as much, but when you put largely and somewhat together, they're still right up there. Big business up there. Governor David Paterson, surprisingly, only 31% blaming him, despite his lack of popularity, not being blamed for the problems as much. Labor unions, very surprising, 21% largely to blame. State employees, 10% as being largely to blame. So those are very, very surprising statistics. It'll be interesting to hear. I know the panelists will have a lot of comments on those different items as well. Attitudes towards public officials. Voting gives me a say in how the government runs things. 61% agree. State officials don't care what people think. 62% of the people agree. And politicians promise to make government work better, but don't. 78% of the people agree. This, again, pointing to this frustration that people have that's being manifest in all these different elections over the past year, including my own. And this number, I think, will be interesting to track as the year goes on. Right now, it's only something that people are paying quite a lot of attention to. 32% of New Yorkers, 37% of Long Islanders. Some attention, little attention, 57% and 52% New York State and Long Island. So we'll see as the year goes on that people will pay more and more attention to this, or we hope that they will pay more and more attention to this, thanks to groups like Hofstra University and Newsday and Cablevision's local media group trying to bring attention to these issues and sponsoring these type of conversations. And of course, based upon the activities of the different candidates running for office, bringing these issues to the fore for the public to discuss. So again, thank you to our sponsors of today's event. And now I'd like to bring up News 12 Long Island's moderator for today's event, Jody Applegate, and all of our speakers, if they'll come up on the stage as well. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Mr. Swazi. Does this sound good for everybody? Can you hear us? All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here on behalf of News 12, and as a citizen and a voter and a taxpayer myself. We've got some interesting things to talk about. Let me introduce everyone who's up here on the stage today. Bob Keeler, to my right here, is a member of Newsday's editorial board. In his 39 years at the paper, he's also been Albany bureau chief and state editor. He's written about 7 governors, starting with Nelson Rockefeller. Who will be the next one?
I'm not going there.
Well, we'll find out eventually. And now to our panel. 2 of the 4 people interested in becoming the next governor of New York are here. Suffolk County Executive Steve Levy and Buffalo businessman Carl Paladino. Please hold your applause until the end. And just a note for the record, former Congressman Rick Lazio, who is also seeking the GOP nomination, was invited to attend but declined. Attorney General Andrew Cuomo, the only contender that we know of in the Democratic Party, has declined. So now let us begin. Continuing down the row here, Suffolk County Executive Steve Levy served on the Suffolk County Legislature and later in the Assembly. He was elected county executive as a Democrat in 2003 and re-elected in 2007 with Republican cross-endorsement. He won with 96% of the vote, although I'm told he is still disappointed that it wasn't unanimous.
We're finding those 4%, let me tell you.
Maybe that's the margin of error. In April, he announced that he would change parties to seek the GOP nomination for governor. Carl Paladino interrupted his whistle-stop campaign down the Erie Canal in a tugboat to be here today. You got your land legs?
That's right. Oh, yes.
Back on dry land for a little while? He made his fortune as a Buffalo real estate developer and now wants to try his hand at government. If he doesn't win either the Republican or Conservative Party nomination, he's considering establishing a Tea Party line. Senator Dean Skelos of Rockville Center is in his 13th term as a state senator. He's currently the minority leader, but he hopes for not too much longer, right? That's what you're banking on. He's pushing hard for the GOP to take back the Senate, and what happens in the close races right here on Long Island may determine which way the Senate goes. And with us today are 2 state party chairs just days away from their political conventions. Ed Cox was the New York chair for John McCain in 2008, but his work in state politics goes back to 1994 when he played a key role in getting George Pataki elected governor. Cox took control of the New York State Republican Party in September and put himself in the middle of a firestorm by throwing his support to Steve Levy, then a Democrat. Maybe you were just ahead of your time. And Jay Jacobs is the chairman of the New York State Democratic Party and a member of the Democratic National Committee. He's been Nassau County chair since 2001, and during that time he presided over the reemergence of the party in Nassau County. Now he's trying to make sure that Democrats keep control of every elected statewide office as well as Senate and Assembly. Feels like I've been talking for a long time, doesn't it, Bob? All right. Well, let's let our panelists get started. Let's begin with County Executive Levy, who wants to address the mood of the electorate, which is not too good based on what we've just heard.
That's right. Thank you, Jody and Bob. And thanks as well to Hofstra, Newsday, and News 12 for sponsoring this. This was indeed supposed to be a forum for gubernatorial candidates as it started out. But I thank Carl for showing up, but unfortunately the other 2 candidates refused to do so, and I think that's unfortunate. If we're going to have an election, let's get out there and have a spirited debate. Beyond that, I think the poll, as Tom Swazi has noted, confirms a lot what we already knew, and that was that people don't want their taxes raised, and yet they don't want their services cut. And that's why leadership is indeed so important. The thing that I see as I travel around this state, and I'll tell you, when you're campaigning, you have your finger on the pulse as much, if not more, than any poll can ever give you. I see 3 things, 3 emotions: embarrassment, fear, and frustration. The embarrassment comes about that people are fed up with our state government being the butt of comedians' jokes on late-night TV. I think they're fearful of the fact that this may be the first generation that has it not as good, but actually worse than the prior generation. And I think there's frustration over the lack of leadership. And when it comes to embarrassment, you know, when you've had over the last 30 years only about 5 budgets that have been passed on time, people get the impression that the system of government in Albany is indeed dysfunctional. When you saw what happened with the coup last year, who's in charge, who's not, that adds fuel to the fire. When you hear legislators saying that if you're a union and you want to pay $50,000, we'll allow you in our caucus when no one else will be allowed in, that's a sense of embarrassment as well. Then you have a major leader within the Senate saying, when we get control and keep control next year, we're going to gerrymander the other side into the abyss. I mean, when you keep on seeing this kind of stuff, it makes you wonder, what the heck is going on in Albany? And then you talk about people's fears. Why do you think the Tea Party movement is so prominent right now? You have people who are involved in that movement who were never involved in politics or government before. Something is motivating these folks. It's a fear of all the debt and all the spending that is going to saddle their children and their grandchildren. It's motivating these people for the first time in their lives, to get involved. When it comes to frustration, there's ample reasons why the folks in this state should be frustrated. We had a deficit last year as well as this year. They're convened in Albany to deal with the problem, and they leave before they dealt with solving the problem. And what does the governor do? He kicks the can down the road and says, we'll just delay payments to schools and to our agencies and to our local governments, and we'll deal with it another day. And now the big plan that comes out to solve the problem, what is it? Let's borrow $6 billion. Again, not taking control of the problem. This is why people are so incredibly frustrated. They're frustrated as well because as folks in the private sector, they're seeing their jobs cut, and if they still have their jobs, they're losing their benefits, they're certainly not getting raises, and they see the public sector going on in their own little bubble as though it's the boom times of the 1990s. They say, what's up with this? Come on, get real. I mean, you talk about the frustration. People see an MTA tax imposed on their business, and then they see this panel that gives 95% of Long Island Railroad retirees disability pensions on top of their regular pensions. People making $150,000, $200,000 a year for their pension, and the people in the private sector saying, are you kidding me? You know, they see the Triborough Amendment go on along merrily, where the contract expires, yet in the public sector you continue to get your automatic step salary increase. They see mandatory arbitration continuing, which leads to us on Long Island having to pay police officers up to $200,000 a year. They see disability rules that say if you're employed in state government or county government, you fall off your chair. You stay home, you collect 100% of your salary tax-free. You make more money if you stay home than if you go to work, only in New York and only in the private sector. And you wonder why people are frustrated and they want a revolution. They look at a pension system that's going to implode. People are losing their pensions or they're getting cut in the private sector. You know, you put in a little bit of money, your employer matches it and it grows with the economy, or it doesn't grow with the economy. But in the public sector, it's guaranteed 8% return. It's going to implode. It can't keep up this way. It's not sustainable. And the public is demanding that leaders take some action. They see leaders who are too beholden to the public employee unions and the special interest in Albany, and they're begging for change. So the good news is that when you look at one of the polls, it says, can the state change with proper leadership? And the answer there is in the affirmative. So that gives us a great deal of hope.
Let me follow up, Steve. Question for you and I guess for Dean, of being the elected officials who are here. What caused this magical thinking that's going on among the public that we can solve the problem, but we can't cut spending and we can't raise taxes? Was that magical thinking that flows from their own native dementia, or did politicians lead them to that? And how can we,
Well-
I mean, are you going to be speaking out in that campaign saying, folks, you can't keep thinking this way. You got to begin to realize there are only certain ways to bring a budget under control, and they're painful.
Sure. Well, why do they think it can be done? Because they've seen it done. They've seen it done in Suffolk County, where we inherited a deficit of $238 million, and all the pundits and naysayers said, you can't solve this without major tax increases or dislocations of services. Well, we did it. We privatized our HMO. We put things out to bid. We shrunk the size of our workforce. We got concessions from our unions, and we've had 6 years in a row without a general fund property tax increase. They're seeing it in Jersey, with a real leader, Chris Christie, saying times have to change. We have to do something different. What can we do on the state level? What I proposed, hey, look, in New York City, when they were on the verge of bankruptcy in the 70s, in Erie County, in Nassau County, back in the 90s, the state had to come in and say, we're taking over. Get out of the way, because you guys can't get out of your own way. So they put a financial control board in place. You know what we need in the state right now? We need an independent control board that comes in and says, here are the things you need. You need a spending cap. You need a real property tax cap. You have to waive the capital gains to spur economic development. You have to change this crazy system of school aid where we keep on rewarding failure. You have to change the Medicaid beast where we pay more than Florida, Texas, and Carolina combined. There are things we can do. You put them all in one bill. It's what I call the Bill to Save New York, an omnibus bill, the way we do it in Suffolk County. And it's one vote, folks, up or down, and all the eyes of every New Yorker, every editorialist, every pundit will be focused on those legislators. You vote yes to save New York, or you vote no and allow us to go into bankruptcy. So there is an answer.
Let me switch over to Dean. And Dean, thanks for coming. You're the only representative of the legislature, and I appreciate your bravery.
I notice we're overwhelmed by Republicans here. I wish a few more Democrats were
But
here.
what's your sense of that? How can we get people past that magical thinking, get us to really tackle those problems?
You know, Bob, if you ask people, do you want their health care cut, they're going to say no. If you ask them, do you want school aid cut, they're going to say no. But if you look at what is driving the deficit in New York State, it is overspending. Now, let's take the Medicaid program in New York State. We spend 70% more per recipient than the national average. If we were to take the program and bring it down from 70% above the national average to 60% above the national average, the state of New York would save approximately $1 billion, and there would be several $100 million that local property taxpayers would save because of the mandate on the counties that Steve has gone through and Tom when he was county executive. So there are ways when you talk about reform and restructuring, let's look at the programs in New York State and what are driving the cost. The Medicaid program in New York State, we want to make sure that those who truly need assistance get the assistance. But when a person who is on Medicaid goes to a dentist in a non-emergency way and can hire an ambulette to take them there, that's going to cost hundreds of dollars, there's something wrong with the system. So I think all of us agree that those who truly need assistance, and New York are very good people when it comes to helping those who truly need assistance, they're there for it. But when you see the system being abused and taken advantage of, under Obamacare, when this kicks in, there are going to be approximately 1 million more people in the Medicaid system in New York State. And unless we restructure that and reform, and when you talk about restructuring and reform, it's not just about different how you run the Senate, how you don't run the Senate. It's about restructuring our whole budgeting process, looking at programs. Do we need them now? If we were to consolidate different agencies and control spending within the agencies, we could save over $200 million. If we looked at with the Medicaid system itself. Now, the governor and last year the Democrat all-controlled legislature eliminated upfront detection for fraud and abuse. That would be no more finger imaging and no more in-person interviews. We figure that alone could save the state $40 million. So the answer is people are frustrated. We understand the frustration, and it's really because of the fact that many in Albany are not listening to that frustration. And that's what it's about. If you make a tough decision, People may not be 100% happy with it, but they're going to appreciate that people are making tough decisions. And that's what's needed. When we had our first five-way meeting 2 days ago with the leadership, and I think if you want to talk about a reform and how you get on-time budgets, in 2007, when the entire legislature became frustrated with late budgets, we passed the Budget Reform Act of 2007 that requires each majority to put out their budget resolution or budget and then to start joint conference committees. That's the law. And up to this point, the Democrat-controlled Senate, the Democrat-controlled Assembly have refused to meet in joint conference committees so that we can be in public and go through the budget, lay out our positions, the media can be there, and then you get a budget. And when we did that in 2008, we had an on-time budget. And that's the frustration that people are, that's really getting to them. The bickering, the lack of bipartisanship. And that's what we have to go. We have to treat each member with respect, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, listen to them, and come out behind closed doors.
Bob, you talked about magical thinking, and I guess it's human nature to want to have your cake and eat it too, and that's, how we'd all like to have the world if we could, and in a sense, I guess that's reflected in the government that we create for ourselves. So in a weird way, I guess it's democracy, but it's creating a lot of anger out there. Let's move down the line here now to Carl Paladino, who also wants to talk about taxes and spending. Carl?
Thank you, Joey. I agree with Dean. Excuse me. Thank you for the invite. We have a problem. Our problem in government today is basically transparency. Our government, as illustrated here, sends out vibes of frustration to the public. They do not tell the public what is going on. And I disagree with the thought that the government or that the people don't want to cut services. They do want to cut services, except that they don't understand where the problems are. The press has done a terrible job, a very shallow job, in describing where the particular problems are. We have a huge problem in Medicaid. Dean outlined the basics of it. $43.5 billion, more than in total number, more than the entire state of California, which has double our population, and the entire state of Texas, which has 4 million people more than we have, combined. That's how bad it is. He says 70%. 70% over the national average. Now, what's the result of that? The Supreme Court said we can't close borders, okay? We have to, under the 14th Amendment, we have to allow anyone from America to come into New York State. We have to allow them to come in, and the moment they arrive, they are deemed to be residents, and they're entitled to the full boat of benefits. Well, when we provide benefits that are 70% higher than the closest state, we're inviting them. We're inviting every poor and disenfranchised person in America to come here to New York State. And what happens then? Well, then you get into all these other problems: immigration, crime. I mean, it's a social breakdown, which we're all witnessing today. And it's all emanating from a very careless government that has given us a Medicaid program that is debilitating presently and that will be totally catastrophic in the proximate future when Obamacare comes into play. This benefit package that is provided, they call them optional benefits above the federal base. Many states select different benefits that they want to put out there above that base. And California is the second highest state. New York has optional benefits 100% higher than those benefits in California. Why? A story in the Buffalo News a couple weeks back. Medicaid treats people who are smokers as addicts, addicted to smoking. And therefore they are, under the Medicaid rules, entitled to transportation. So to go get their cigarettes, they're entitled to transportation. So a person from the inner city of Buffalo gets in a cab and drives 40 miles out to the Seneca Nation to get his carton of cigarettes and save $6 on buying a carton. He hands in the $90 cab fee to the government, and the government pays it. Now, how upside down are we? How far off the page? That's a symbol. That's a symbol of the carelessness that's out there right now in implementing the present rules. I'm going to just give you a little outline of what some of the optional benefits are. Optometrists, psychologists, private duty nursing offered only in 27 states. Physician-directed clinic services, physical therapy, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, audiology services, dental, prescription drugs, dentures, prosthetic devices, eyeglasses, diagnostic services, screening services, preventive services, mental health rehabilitation and stabilization, inpatient hospital nursing services, intermediate care facility services for MR, inpatient psychiatric service, personal care services, targeted case management, primary case management, hospice care, all-inclusive care for the elderly, only offered in 22 states, transportation services, nursing facility services under age of 21, emergency hospital services for non-Medicare participating hospitals. It goes on and on and on. Now, in a lot of cases, we may choose that these benefits are appropriate, but the abuse is horrific, and it's out of control. This alone, if we cut back to the California standard of optional benefits, if we just cut back to that, we will save approximately $22 billion a year. $10 billion of that is federal money, $5 billion of it is the state, and another a quarter of it is the goes to the local share to help us cut down on local property taxes. It will also send out a message to all those people that choose to come here and become residents, but non-tax-paying type of residents. They're just going to live on the fat of the land. I tell the story because it tells a little bit more. I tell the story of a guy named John Smith, and John Smith is an individual. He's from Idaho, and he has a wife and 3 kids, and he just graduated from college. And John Smith has decided that he wants to go on to dental school. His father's a dentist, and he wants to practice in the family practice. So John applies to various dental schools, and he applies to the University of Buffalo. And he gets accepted at the University of Buffalo, and the University of Buffalo, as a SUNY school, charges $12,870 a year in non-resident tuition. The average tuition, the average non-resident tuition in America today is $21,500. The average tuition in our SUNY system, $7.8 billion all-in budget divided by 664,331 students, is roughly $23,000 a year. But we charge non-residents $12,870 a year. So John Smith comes to register, okay? He comes a couple days early. On Monday morning, he goes down to the social welfare office. He applies for welfare for his family and himself. They've never paid taxes in the state of New York. John Smith in the afternoon goes down to, he gets the full boat of welfare, by the way, housing, gas bill, the whole boat. In the afternoon, he goes down and registers his kids at the local school system, another burden onto our school system, our local property taxes. Then John goes back and he studies real hard in his first year of school. Does a good job. He didn't have to work like many of us did because he was on welfare. We were paying for it. Neither John nor his father or anybody of his ancestors ever paid any New York State taxes. Now what happens? He does very well in his first year. He's going to go into his second year. He gets the bill from SUNY. He is now deemed to be a resident. His tuition bill is $4,950. He has no intention of ever staying in the state of New York. He's going back to Idaho and practicing the family business. But that's how careless we are. Those are those little things that the public wants to know about. The public wants to know, tell us, leaders, what's wrong particularly, and then we'll make a judgment. The broad strokes of the poll can't identify where the people want to cut. But when we go out there and tell them stories like this, true stories, and show them evidence of it, they'll sign off real quick. And that's what we're going to be about. We're going to go to Albany and we're going to pick through every division, every department of every agency and every authority, and we're going to find out where the fat is, and we're going to find out where the carelessness is, and we're going to find out where the negligence is, and we're going to cut and trim, and I promise you, I will get it down 20% in the first year. I will knock it down.
Can I just follow up with a question there, Carl? You know, there's some magical thinking that goes around Medicaid as well. A lot of people would like to see the Medicaid program cut, but not the particular benefits that they have to use themselves. So how would you go about cutting the Medicaid? Would you put in a bill right away when you first became governor and put in exactly the benefits that you would cut? And Steve, maybe you could follow up with that as well.
Well, as soon as I take my hand off the budget, I've got roughly 30 days to submit a budget to the legislature. So we'll be cutting those Medicaid benefits in that first budget right away. We'll be addressing it hopefully in the period between Election Day and when we take office, and we will address it with the professionals. We'll bring in the people that administer these programs and have them tell us exactly where the crime is, where the waste is, okay? And then we will, in our first budget, submit it onto the legislature. If the legislature doesn't agree, as you know, the budget process is that I submit a budget to the legislature, and they can delete anything they want from my budget, and I can't do a thing about it.
I could tell you with some
let me just finish that thought. But if they add anything to the budget, every addition is treated as a separate bill, and every addition I can veto as a separate item. And as long as I have Dean and 1/3 of the Senate plus one, they can't override my veto, and that's going to be the end of that nonsense.
I can tell you with some specificity as to what the problems are with Medicaid. First of all, you have to understand the problem to get the solutions. And the problem is that it's 20% of the users that are creating 60 plus, so almost 2/3 of the cost of Medicaid. One of the problems we have is a lack of oversight management. So much time on the people on the front line is spent on intake, just taking the forms, processing the forms. Are you eligible? Are you not eligible? And there's very little time left for actually managing. Why do you need to manage? Well, we have various databases within our state government, and we don't match these databases. It's something we should be doing. You have one database that shows all of the people who got care rides paid for by Medicaid to go to the doctor. And then you have another database that shows if they ever showed up to the doctor. And you find out that many of them did not when you actually cross-reference the database. They don't do that right now. You have a problem where a small proportion are using the emergency rooms 37 times in a year for headaches and stomach aches. But there's no management to stop that. You have another situation where we're paying already the premium for managed care for our children. Why? Because you want them to get the primary care so they don't get sick and lead to more expenses. You have many children within that system who have not gone to the doctor all year, despite the fact that we're paying the premium for it. So we need the case management to follow up and say, ma'am, we're calling, Johnny or Jane has not gone to the doctor this year. That's how you solve the problem. It's better management. Now, there's a tremendous amount of fraud in this system, no doubt. But a great part of the problem is a lack of oversight in the management in this system that has gotten so out of control. You have to understand the problems before you can get to the solutions. One more is generic drugs, a perfect example. We've been doing a study on this within all of our counties. We just studied 12 counties. And if there was follow-up management to ensure that those on Medicaid are actually taking the generic brand rather than the brand name, which they're required to do and they don't, $55 million can be saved annually. It's not being done. That's the problem that will be done when I get into office.
All right. Unlike the state budget, this event will be brought in on time. I've been told 11 a.m. I'm here to bring the tough love, so let's move down the line. Senator Skelos, we did hear from you somewhat, so it's your opportunity now to address the question you'd like to, and then I definitely want to hear from the two remaining panelists who've been so quiet down there at the end of the table. But let's go ahead, Senator Skelos. We don't want to deprive you of the chance to bring up your own point and address it, so let's go on with that.
Well,
you go ahead. Yep.
Let me just say right now on Long Island and throughout the New York State, the number one issue with people are, well, there are a series of issues, what people want. And they're frustrated that government isn't doing it. They don't want tax increases. They don't want the $11 billion that the all-Democrat legislature raised last year and the governor. They don't want the payroll tax, which is killing businesses or not-for-profits. Probably a couple of $1 million in Nassau County, an extra cost to the county, which relates to real property taxes. They want government not to waste their money. Right? They don't want government to waste their money. They want government to cut spending where appropriate and not to waste money. They want private sector job creation. They want to empower the private sector community to create jobs, not tax them and tax them and tax them so that they leave the state. Job creation should be in the private sector, not in the public sector. And they don't want any more debt. And they don't want any more debt. Their frustration is that government is not listening to them. And that's what we have to do. We have to listen. And when people lose elections is generally when they don't listen. Now, the dysfunction in Albany. When we had our election 2 years ago, people of the state made a decision that dysfunction would end if Democrats control the governorship in all branches of government. I don't believe anybody right now would believe that that dysfunction has disappeared. So that's a frustration that people have. And they also want to have balance in government, checks and balance. And I think that's what was critically important over the years, that there was a Republican majority so that there was some checks and balances. Right now in the New York State Senate, every single leader, whether it's John Sampson, Malcolm Smith, Pedro Espada, Finance Chair Carl Kruger, in the Assembly, Shelley Silver, all leadership, including the governor, are Democrats from New York City. Now, I'm not being partisan, but the bottom line is, where are the suburban interests being protected? Where are the suburban interests being protected? Last year, the budget that was passed, Long Island traditionally gets 13% of the increase in aid to education. 13%. People are not happy about that because we're 17% of the population. Last year, and every Republican voted against it, and every Democrat voted for it in the Senate, including our Democrat senators from Long Island, our share was cut to 5%. Now, what does that represent? Higher property taxes. That's wrong. So what people are looking for in government, and I think they're not happy with one-party rule. Years ago, in Nassau County, when it was one-party rule under the Republicans, after a while, people didn't like it, and they changed to Tom Suozzi. And I think what you're seeing on the federal level and the state level, people are frustrated with all Democrat rule in Washington or in New York State, and they're looking for change. They want balance, and they want people to listen to it.
All right, let's hear now from the two state party chairs, beginning with you, Mr. Cox. What's on your mind today?
Let me just say, Dean made a very good point about checks and balances. As opposed to the parliamentary system where one party takes over the parliament and has complete control, as they do in Britain, all branches of government. Here, we believe in Madisonian checks and balances. We believe that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and therefore we like to have both parties have each of the parties have a different piece of government. That's just the American system. Getting to the basic issues here, and I think that the elected legislator here and those who are looking to be elected governor hit it, the specific points very well, but I'd like to take a step back and go to the poll issues. And in question 4 of it, if you add together the state budget, this is the question: what is the most important problem you face, you think that New York State faces today? And the answers, if you take a look, and they're very interesting. If you add them together, 37% say state budget problems, state taxes, and property taxes. Those are government issues. And then you add together unemployment, jobs, underemployment, economy in general, you get 38%. Now, most people gave one answer. You add those together, 75% of the people are worried about the economy, jobs, and what government is doing about those things. And those are linked in people's minds. How does that happen? You take a look at a family today here in Long Island. As Tom Swazi pointed out, they have seen the value of their 401k shrink, but they have also seen the value of their home crash. They have lost their savings. They feel that their employment is threatened if they are employed and not underemployed. And they are therefore saving more, they are spending less, and now they're looking at government, which has its deficit. They've closed their family deficit. What's government doing? Now, government here in New York State has, looking at a $9 billion deficit this year, $25 billion deficit potentially next year when the federal stimulus funds go away. And federally, a $1.5 trillion deficit next year, and $1 trillion deficits going out beyond that. And they're saying, how are they going to close that? Well, they got two alternatives. Either they cut spending or they tax me more. And that's why those budget issues and the tax issues come right to the top of these polls. And that's the question that the issue that the electorate next November is going to be saying, who's the best person to cut spending here? To make the decision among those items that they don't want to have cut. The public, you're right, they don't want to have them cut, but they're going to elect someone who they feel is going to do the right job of cutting those spending items in the right way. Now, it's not the legislature that does that. Starts with the governor, it starts with the executive. And fortunately here in New York State, thanks to the wisdom of Charles Evans Hughes and Al Smith in the late 20s, an amendment to the Constitution, the governor has extraordinary powers over the budget, which are held up by the Court of Appeals in the early part of this decade. And so they're looking for a governor that is going to use those powers and use them well, and understands how to cut a budget. So this year that's coming up is going to be the year of the fiscal conservative, the year of the forgotten taxpayer of New York State. There's a huge taxpayers revolt going on. If you don't believe that, look at the elections of last November 3. I think, Tom, you're very well aware what happened in those elections. An unknown came from nowhere here in in Nassau County. Same in 2-1 Democratic Westchester County. And the taxpayers of those counties, and those are the two highest tax counties in the United States, said we want to change. We want someone who's determined to cut spending and not to raise taxes. And that wave that's been building is going to keep building right through next November. And the gubernatorial candidate who comes across as most intelligent and determined, most important, determined, has the political will to cut spending and cut spending in a way that works, that's the candidate who's going to win the governorship.
Let's hear from Jay Jacobs now, and then open it up for more follow-ups. Mr.
Great,
Jacobs?
thank you very much. You know, I came here today, and I'm a little different than the poll results. I wasn't frustrated, and I wasn't angry until I sat here for a time. Yeah.
Are you mad?
But
And let me guess.
Jay, I am.
You're not going to take it anymore, right?
let me say this. You know, the interesting thing, I'm going to point to a few things Tom pointed out, I think, very astutely. But I was going to focus on the frustration and anger, and when Tom pointed out that 78% of the voters believe that politicians promise but yet don't deliver, I think you can see a bit of an example of it here today and where the problem is, why there is frustration and anger. I think we've got to look at that. You know, the voters understand the problems they have today, which, by the way, a lot of that frustration and anger, those are economic issues that are bothering them. The fact is we're in a very tough economic time, and we pointed out here in this panel, appropriately so. People have lost their incomes, some have lost their jobs, they've lost the value of their savings, their homes. And that's going to create upset, which will feed anger and frustration. But the voters know this didn't happen over a year or 2 years. This has been decades in the making. They've seen this thing mount year after year, whether it was a Democratic governor or a Republican governor. They see that New York State government, as it has functioned, is broken. That was the basis of Tom Suozzi's Fix Albany campaign when he ran. That was the basis of many of the initiatives and reforms that he brought out when he ran, and that have now been adopted fairly much across the board, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side. And you know, it's interesting. I sat here and I listened to Steve Levy, who I respect tremendously, and I certainly am not going to dispute any of the achievements and accomplishments that he did in Suffolk, but I remind everybody he did them as a Democratic county executive in a Democratic government in Suffolk. And I think that it's interesting to note that Tom Suozzi made very many of the same and even some very much more substantial changes here in Nassau County, which reversed decades of economic decline. And that was a Democratic government with a Democratic county executive. So the theory that, you know, Democrats don't know how to run government isn't borne out by the examples we have. I like to remember what Bill Clinton once said at the convention. He was repeating a former president who said, "If you want to live like a Republican, you better vote Democratic." And that seems to be borne out. If you take a look at the stock market and how it's gone, it's the same. Now, you know, I listened to Dean Skelos, also a friend who I like tremendously, and he talks about the dysfunction in government. He wasn't being partisan at the time, I know, but I want you to know that when you listen to Dean, you have to think that this man has not been up in Albany in the Senate and is on his way there for the first time. I have to tell you, he was in the Republican majority with Mr. Bruno for quite a number of years. And by the way, the guy who was that very all-powerful governor, you know, the governor's power is very powerful, that fellow's name was Pataki. And a lot of these Medicaid reforms that we're hearing about, and now you get a sense of why the voters have that 78% who think they hear promises but things aren't kept. Well, you had George Pataki. You had the budget power. You had the Senate majority. With all of these problems in Medicaid we hear, and these things are astounding. I'm sitting here myself, my jaw was almost open. Some of these things are horrific and need to be changed. I'm not going to defend the indefensible, but I will tell you that this is the problem, and this is why you see those poll results. You see those poll results because people have heard the same thing from the same politicians, Republican and Democratic, year in and year out, and yet nothing gets done. You've got a problem with special interests. Both parties do. You have a problem with the way government functions. You have a problem with the way government interacts. It's great on the campaign to talk about, and in forums like this, bipartisanship, and let's get to work, and let's get out there, and transparency and all the rest. Well, the problem with bipartisanship is too often, too many of the political leaders are interested in power and not solution. And what then ends up happening is, if I agree with the majority that's in now, or I help the majority solve the problem, I have abdicated my ability in the next campaign to convince the voters that the job is being done so terribly, so it should be handed over to me. That is the problem in our current political process. That's why you see frustration and anger building, because voters who no longer have the extra cash in their pockets, so maybe it doesn't make that much of a difference, now find themselves at wit's end and sometimes at the rope's end, and they can't make it and they're angry. And then I listened to Carl Paladino, who I am sure is a distinguished and very successful, I know he's a successful businessman. I run a business myself, and I know that's not easy to accomplish, so I respect that. But I can only imagine the poor immigrant sitting somewhere in South America, leafing through the Medicaid rules to figure out what state they're going to move to get the best chance to come in. And I don't know, but I don't think that's exactly what's motivating them either. I'd like to think that statue that sits in the middle of the harbor in New York, which represents what we're about, what we've always been about, what has made America great, may be the inspiration that brings them here. And if some of the rules need changing, like not allowing that cigarette addict to take the taxi to the Indian reservation for tax-free cigarettes, why there have been a lot of opportunities under Republican governments to get it done. And yes, that doesn't mean we shouldn't get it done, but going out in an election year and pointing to the extreme examples, and I kind of remember the welfare queen that Ronald Reagan pointed to many years ago, that's not going to win the day, because the old playbook of using fear and anger to win over the electorate when times are this tough is not going to make it, and it's not going to solve the problem. My suggestion, and I'll end with this, is that we need leaders who will present a vision. We know the times are tough. We know that people are hurting. And we know that something needs to get done. And I will bet you that voters here on Long Island and in New York State, with the proper leadership, will be willing to sacrifice, will be willing to accept cuts in areas that they'd rather not and should be cut, will be willing maybe to ante up a little bit more if they know it's going to a government that's going to spend their money wisely and fairly. And we have to create a vision for Americans and vision for people in New York and Long Island that says, here is where Long Island will be in 2020, here's where it will be in 2030 and beyond, and here is how we're going to get you there. The party that does that will be the party that wins this November.
I agree with Bob. I agree with Jay completely, but he would make it sound that in Albany there's been a Republican unicameral legislature, and I think he forgets that Shelley Silver, one of the leaders for years, has been the biggest obstacle to reform. And certainly for those of us who live in suburban communities, has been an individual that feels that Nassau County taxpayers should be paying more. And I remember a number of years ago with Governor Cuomo indicating when he was cutting our school aid that we all had polo ponies in our backyards, and that's why he had to cut it. Now, I know I don't have a polo pony in my backyard, but I am listening to the taxpayers and the real property taxpayers in my community and throughout my district, and they do want, Jay, bipartisanship. Now, when an individual says there should be bipartisanship, to ridicule it is wrong. Now, last year, when the Republicans were out of the majority, you had the Democrats negotiate a budget behind closed doors, and every single one of them pointed that it was not necessary to have Republicans in negotiations because everything now is Democrat. And we saw $13 billion in more spending in a recession, $11 billion in more taxes, stimulus money that came from Washington absolutely wasted. And when you mention Medicaid reform, which is absolutely necessary, and you know, you can joke around about can a person read this or read that. The bottom line is the dentist billing for 32 fillings from one person in one day is real. That's fraud and abuse. The person taking the Ambulette at hundreds of dollars to the dentist, that's real. And looking at the entire Medicaid system in New York State, if we don't look at it and attack it aggressively in a very, very positive way, maintaining benefits for those who need, we are not going $52 billion a year in the Medicaid system in New York State. $1 billion a week is being spent on Medicaid. Real property taxpayers can't afford it. New York State can't afford it. And unless we get real about it and we get the Speaker on board to make sure that there are reforms to the Medicaid system, not just say slash hospitals and slash nursing homes, you have to look at the structural reform within the system in terms of what's driving the cost. That's what's necessary. And Jay, if you want to talk about hypocrisy, last year your Democrat majority took away the STAR rebate check from our seniors and our middle income families, all right, billions of dollars in the state, and now they're talking about restoring it. All right? That's hypocrisy.
Dean, let me just take a
Excuse me
quick...
for a second, Mr. Chairman. Just in the interest of getting back from the red meat to the spinach, I wanted to ask something that comes off what you said, Chairman Cox, about our Constitution, the wisdom of the Constitution. Let's talk about the structure, because 70% of these people want structural reform in the state of New York and not so much caring about whether it's a Republican or a Dem, okay? What about a constitutional convention? Only 41% of the people said they want to do that, and yet you talked about our strong governor who doesn't even have the power to pick his own lieutenant governor until the Court of Appeals invented it a few months ago. Should we change the Constitution, and will you folks speak up for that? The Constitution has a lot in there about the width of ski trails, by the way, but nothing about how to pick a lieutenant governor when the governor goes all black socks.
Let me make one. One general statement here, and Jay referred to Lady Liberty in the harbor, and this is a land of opportunity, and New York State was the state of opportunity. The tragedy is, if you go back to a study done by the Mercator Institute at George Mason University, and they ranked by a set of very good criteria states according to their freedoms, economic freedoms and personal freedoms. And New York State ranks 50th, dead last in economic freedoms. We're no longer the state of opportunity. And in personal freedoms, we rank 49th, next to last. That's the tragedy of New York State at this point. We have overlay of regulations and government control of things, which if we're going to grow the economy, we need to have, and it starts with the governor again, a governor who's going to go after those rules and regulations that have tied down this state that used to be the state of opportunity. With respect to structural reforms, and I saw that everyone's in favor of structural reforms. I am too. Carl mentioned transparency. I think that's the most important structural reform you can have. But I think what's going to happen in the election in November, if Jay's party wants to campaign on structural reforms, while we campaign on economic growth and policies that promote growth, and how very specific mandates, looking for very specific mandates from the people of the state as to how we're going to cut spending and deregulate this state and free it up once more. I'm very happy to have that kind of be the competition, because I think in the end, the structural reforms are not what people are concerned about. They're concerned about the economic conditions in this state. It's really, to paraphrase what a Democrat said, it's the economy, stupid, at this point, and it's the deficits, federal and state, at this point.
Mr. Paladino, the smoker in the taxi and some of the other specifics you mentioned were addressed, so I want to give you a chance to respond.
I think, Jay, you and many of the other leaders in this state are in denial. The reality is that the people not only want transparency, they not only want fiscal responsibility, but they want ethics. They want an ethical government. They want people that are going there to serve the public. It is an honor to serve. It's not a right, and they want change. Structural change, yes. Do we want a representative government? How many people in this room right now know what is going on under the budget deliberation? And if you go and you ask your legislator, he's going to say, oh, I haven't heard yet. Is this a representative democracy? Have they told us what's going on? How is our government functioning today? How far off the page have we gotten that Dean has to talk about one man in a room? Sheldon. There's one man in a room, and everybody's waiting for his counsel on how this budget's going to be put together. That must end. We're entitled to something different, and we've gotten so far off the page, and the people have been so complacent and accepting of that they can't hear, that the leaders can't hear right now the rumblings out there. These aren't strangers coming out of the woods. They aren't aliens from someplace else. These are Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, and liberals. Okay, they've had enough of a corrupt government. They've had enough of the corrupt ways of the government. They want to get back to a reality. They want to be competitive for jobs. We are not competitive for jobs. We go back and we answer all these questions, taxes, spending, jobs, and it all comes down to responsible, benevolent government. That's the problem we have today. And you guys have to face it. Stop the denial. The party leaders have to understand it. Where people want change. They're sick of it. There it is right there. 90%. Frustrated or angry.
I think Steve is ready to answer my question about the constitutional amendment.
Yes.
And then, Steve, you could pivot to the nuclear weaponry in this debate, which is initiative and referendum. We've all seen
that was
how well
next on
that's
the list.
worked in California, but 70% of the voters seem to want that. Should we change the Constitution? Should we have initiative and referendum?
Well, I would be strongly in favor of constitutional convention if it's structured properly, because it can be a very dangerous thing if you have the same special interests and elected officials in control of the state government now controlling the constitutional convention.
Let me stop you right there. Brian Colm, who's the minority leader of the Assembly, he's a Republican. He has a proposal for a People's Constitutional Convention.
I'm with it.
You have to choose, if you get elected as a delegate to the Constitution, to be either a delegate or to continue in your elective office. How do you think about that idea?
If you want
If you
to
get
be
elected as a delegate to the Constitution, you then have to choose to continue as if you have an elective office already.
Yeah, you shouldn't be. No, we shouldn't have elected officials. It should be the People's Convention. If so, it could be a great thing. Here's some of the things you can do with it. The governor should have, and it's debated whether or not he has this power, the ability to impound up to 10% of the funds. I have that ability. That's what has kept Suffolk County solvent. When we lost sales tax, I was able to say, across the board, 10% cut everywhere. It saved the county. We have to make sure the governor has that power as well. We should never have another late budget in the history of New York State. It's so easy. Do what they do on the town levels and the county levels. Have you ever heard of a town or a county having a late budget? No, because we have provisions. The executive puts in his budget. The legislature has 2 months to do whatever they want with it. If they don't do something within a certain period of time, the buzzer goes off, time's up, and the executive's budget takes effect. It's as simple as that. You'll never have another late budget. That's what a constitutional convention can do. Put in the property tax cap and the spending cap in place with a constitutional amendment, and you don't have to worry about it anymore. As to the initiative and referendum, I was a sponsor of that legislation both on the county level and on the state level. It didn't muster enough support because a lot of times elected officials don't like to cede that kind of a power. Now, it can go awry, and it can lead to irresponsible measures from time to time. That's why you have the courts. But for people who are saying, I don't know if I want this thing, many of them who are on the fence are now saying, this may be the only way. If we don't start electing the right leadership in this state, especially in the governor's position, maybe we need the ability through the signature, the gathering process, to finally get on the ballot the type of massive reforms that have been resisted, swept under the rug for all these years by those in charge. So I'm for it. I've been for it consistently throughout my career. Power to the people, that's what democracy is all about.
The Wicks Law, the Triborough Amendment, these are like no-brainers. Why do we punish the taxpayers of the state and hold out a special class of people for prevailing wages? Why do we do that? Upstate, 90% of the work is done by non-union workers. But why do we punish the taxpayers with 25 and 30% premiums? Because we give all our state work to a selective group of people. He was right. I mean, these are important issues, the Triborough Amendment, the Wicks, to be addressed by a constitutional convention and or by an amendment to the Constitution. This is probably the one paramount issue. Constitutional convention. People are afraid of it because they're afraid that the progressives have too much of a foothold in New York State. They're afraid that they will come in and they'll hurt us even more. I'm not a believer in that. I believe that a constitutional convention will help us set things straight. And it's going to take 2 years, by the way, before you go through all the processes. I'll demand one from the moment I take my hand off the Bible.
Can I, because it's pretty lonely down here all the way on the left, you know, trying to get a word in edgewise with my good friends and colleagues on the right.
Although, from the audience, you are on the far right.
Well, that's true.
When somebody says, my good friends and colleagues, be careful.
Well, you're right. I want to counter Carl, made mention that he thought I was delusional, and I know that Dean has mentioned hypocrisy, and I want to go back to delusion and hypocrisy, and I want to pick off on Steve's embarrassment, because, Steve pointed out that when he's gone around the state, that is one of the things voters are feeling, and I would agree with them. But I want to point to something that, pivot off something that Dean had said, getting back again about the dysfunction in Albany. When you're in a party, whether you're a Republican Party or Democratic Party, You don't always get to choose and pick who your members are, who runs on your ticket. That happens. And I am sure that there are countless examples of Republican individuals who can have embarrassed members of the Republican Party, and not to their fault, and members of the Democratic Party who have done the same. So I don't think it's in any party. But I will tell you this. Dean, you made mention that the voters in the last election gave the power completely to the Democrats to control the Senate, the Assembly, and the governorship. Yet it wasn't long into the term where you decided to, in essence, get into bed with Spada and Montserrat to change and take power. And I think that we saw that, and you saw it after a period of time, whenever you get into bed with people, you have the chance to get what happens when you get into bed with people. That may have been what actually happened. But frankly, I would say to you that we have to be careful, and very careful, about looking at the equation here and talking about dysfunction and not taking ownership. I want to remind you, these issues are decades in the making. We've had Republican governors who've been all-powerful. We have to get together, and we have to make sure that when we talk to voters, we're talking about the true issues, the true solutions. And yes, bipartisanship, I don't mean to minimize it. I think it'd be something we could work on, but it has to be genuine. And it has to produce, regardless who has the government at the time, it has to produce results that benefit the people, and it has to be productive. And that's what bipartisanship should really be about.
I couldn't agree more with Jay, and that's why we got results when the Budget Reform Act was followed. In 2008, we had an on-time budget. But unfortunately, the Democrat leadership in Albany feels that you don't have to obey the law, and that's why we have a late budget. Now, you mentioned certain issues in terms of your poll. Republicans, when we were in the majority, we voted for initiative and referendum. It was stopped by the Democrats. We passed it in the Senate. When we were in the majority, we voted for a property tax cap. It's stopped by the Democrats in the Assembly. When we were in the majority, we voted for a state spending cap, passed in the Senate. It was stopped by the Democrats in the Assembly. So we have a record, and this is facts. I mean, that's what it's, you can't dispute it. We voted for initiative and referendum. We voted for a spending cap for the state so that if that spending cap had gone into effect when we were in the majority last year, we would have spent, in New York State, the Democrats would have had to have spent $6.5 billion less. $6.5 billion less if the spending cap was in place. So we have a record of voting for the reforms that your people that you've polled indicate they want. We've listened to them, but you have to talk to the Democrats that have the other house, or both houses now, to get them passed.
The clock is ticking up towards 11. I'm going to give the two gubernatorial candidates and the one actual elected official the opportunity for a rare thing, a one-word answer. Mr. Paladino, you raised the question of SUNY tuition. And as you know, the tuition at SUNY is set by the legislature, and SUNY would like to see it set by SUNY. So my question to you is, who should set the SUNY tuition? SUNY itself or the legislature? One word.
Legislature.
Legislature?
Yes.
Steve?
Elected officials bring accountability.
Over the limit. Officials.
Officials.
And finally, Dean.
You know, I believe...
It's tough, isn't it?
After I, you will pass the one
I
word
believe
answer.
in the people.
People.
Okay.
SUNY.
SUNY.
Okay.
It's actually an acronym with 4 words, but
Okay.
we'll accept that. Well, when the governor says, Scotty, beam me up, you know that something is broken, but we thank our distinguished panel for airing their ideas on how to fix it, and thanks so much to my distinguished colleague, Bob, and we're going to turn it back over to Tad Smith now for some closing remarks.
Yeah, just 3 things. First of all, I want to comment that Steve Levy is absolutely right when he started his remarks by pointing out that it was originally intended to be a gubernatorial discussion. But at the time when we set out, there's a 6-week lead time we need to do for the poll. We did not anticipate that at the end of that period we would not have a Democratic gubernatorial candidate. So we had to make do. And so I would like a special round of applause for all of the people on the panel who have done yeoman's work. Thank you. Secondly, it is also true that we did invite prominent Democrats from both the Assembly and the Senate. For their own reasons, they could not make it. One of them was personal, the other one had a business conflict of some sort. So we give a special round of applause for the man who was both on the left and on the right, on the far side. And finally, two administrative things. First, the website renew-newyork.com is where you can get the webcast. You can also get it on Channel 12. There'll be highlights on News 12. And also, if you are a Cablevision subscriber, I encourage you to check out Channel 612. If you are not a Cablevision subscriber, you're free to see me afterward, and I can sort that out for you. And special rate. No, and finally, one other thing I do want to point out, this is the beginning of a community service effort on the part of Hofstra and News 12 and Newsday. There will be, we anticipate doing additional debates, gubernatorial debates. We anticipate doing potentially an attorney general debate. And if, in fact, it turns into a horse race in the Senate, we will certainly look at that as well. In addition, we'd like to do a conference in September. So look for all of those, both on the websites. There will also be email announcements. And finally, of course, you can get it promoted either on News 12 or on Newsday. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And special thanks to Hofstra, which was a great host.